All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from the break. A very warm welcome to session 5, which is on which business models will prevail. I want to thank Roger and the panelists from the last session for a really fascinating discussion. I want to thank everyone out there on Twitter who's been live tweeting. Looking forward to catching up on that at the end of this session. Of course, before I begin, I'd like to thank ALPS, the program committee, and the organizers for hosting this really important discussion on the future of scholarly communication. So I'm Cameron Naim. I'm the head of open science at CERN, which is the European Organization for Nuclear Research. I manage a broad portfolio of activities that aim to set the standards for a future open science paradigm. This includes managing the operations for Scope 3, which is a global collaboration of over 3,000 libraries from 44 countries. And we've transitioned the discipline of high energy physics to be almost entirely open access. Since 2014, we've supported APC-free publishing of over 45,000 research publications from authors in over 120 countries. So I'm a firm believer in the ability for collective action to enable equitable and open models for scholarly communication. And as such, it gives me a great pleasure to host this session with a stellar lineup of panelists. It's great to see that we have someone from a commercial publisher, a librarian, university press, and a consortium, so a wide range of diverse perspectives to bring to this important topic. It first gives me a real honor to be joined by panelist and co-chair of the session, Jamie Hutchins, who's the vice president of journals in the medicine and life sciences group at Springer Nature. Jamie has 20 years of experience in academic publishing and has worked in university presses and nonprofit and commercial publishing houses. And prior to his current role at Springer Nature, he worked for the EdTech and Aggregator ProQuest. Much of his career has been focused on developing partnerships with many nonprofit scientific and academic organizations. Next up, we have Curtis Brundy joining us, the Associate University Librarian for Scholarly Communications and Collections at Iowa State University. Curtis's work focuses on advancing open access, controlling prices, and increasing transparency. He currently chairs the OA 2020 US Working Group and is involved with several other groups working to transform scholarly communications, including the Subscribe to Open community of practice. Dr. Emily Farrell is the Library Partnerships and Sales Lead at MIT Press, where she works with libraries on ensuring access to digital content. Before the MIT Press, Emily worked both in sales and as an acquisitions editor for linguistics. She holds a PhD in sociolinguistics from Macquarie University in Sydney and serves on the board of the nonprofit legal services organization On Local, as well as the foundation for the Yonkers Public Library. And last but no means least, Charla Lair serves as a senior strategist of open access and scholarly communication initiatives at Lyrasis, which is a nonprofit membership organization that serves libraries, museums, and archives. With master's degrees in library and information sciences and geography, her professional passions fall under the broad umbrella of scholarly communications, and she's particularly interested in exploring how to facilitate community building around the sustainability of scholarly publishing. So Jamie will be helping me today in taking your questions. Please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A, and questions can also be upvoted there. I know that there's also been some really good exchange happening in the chat, but for those of you that feel so inclined, if an interesting question comes up in the chat, please feel free to move it over to the Q&A, because that's the place where we're really going to source some of the questions for my fellow panelists. We're going to be doing this session a little bit differently, so I'm just going to present our scenario, and we're just all going to try and have a conversation on different aspects of the scenario and try and kind of unpack it. Now, the scenario that we've been presented with is as follows. The Scholcom industry reaches its event horizon of openly accessible content versus content behind a paywall, or that is available for purchase or rent. This gives rise to a differentiation of products, models, and a mix of competitors. Although many of these trends were established before the pandemic, many of the antecedents were hastened. So first, let's talk about this first point, that a minority of content is available via subscription, which obviously means that the majority of research output is made available openly. We're already seeing some trends in the industry to suggest that much of the OA landscape, and as David mentioned in the previous session, similar to subscriptions, is being dominated by large commercial players. So Charlotte, I'd like to start with you. I know that much of the work that you're doing relates to collective approaches to advance openness. And so in the context of this point, what kind of an open access future should we be seeking to achieve, and how best do we get to it?
What a great first question. So, and this was brought up in the last session, is kind of where is the money? It's really hard to know right now where the money is. A lot of the experimentation that is out there is allowing for publishers to start making more transparent their business models. There aren't just paywalls, but there are walls around who is participating and how much money these entities are giving, and as that reveals itself, and I think perhaps in the next 30 years, we will have a better sense of where money is, who has the power to spend it, and then actually design the business models around that, taking into consideration that these communities and what disciplines they may want to support, what actually has impact at a local level, because as we become more global in how we act, we do need to have more local infrastructures in place to allow us to act globally. So the models that we're experimenting with now, yes, they're collective models. What we're doing, non-APC crowdfunding types of models, but and Ram Crow would disagree with me, but I would argue that every business model is a collective model. You look inside of any publisher's CRM and you see the community that is supporting that publisher. And so how do we make those communities visible? How do we act collectively in order to support the scholarship that needs to be out there? And those are the risks and the experiments and everything that we're taking now in order for in 30 years that we would see, and be able to say that a minority of the content is under subscription for probably very good reasons, that they would still be behind paywall.
Great. Thanks, Charlotte. I want to turn the question over to Curtis. Curtis, I know that you have been engaging in some kind of transformative agreements at your library, and I was interested in hearing about kind of your take around this kind of conflict between transformative agreements with the larger commercial players, and how that kind of plays into the kind of future that we want to see for scholarly communications. And yeah, so over to you.
Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I think this is going to be a great discussion. I don't typically in my day-to-day work use a 30-year planning horizon. So this has actually been quite an exercise. Just think through what the world's going to look like in 2050. And we don't have to look very far out at 2050. You start searching projections for 2050, and previous session, someone said dystopian, and we can really go down a wormhole of despair looking out at 2050, especially if you get into the climate predictions for things. And trying to connect the work today, for example, with what we're doing with transformative agreements. And if we're talking about deals with big publishers, the one that my library has is our biggest is with Wiley, which is a read and publish agreement. And there is tension there. There is tension around, the two biggest points that I worry about with those types of agreements are, one, the equity side of it. I don't think we have figured out how to make those types of agreements and have transparency around author equity and how waiver programs are being handled. That's something we're going to start putting front and center in our negotiations going forward is, what does that look like? How many waivers are being sought? How seamless is the process to get them? And then the other one that, coming off of the pandemic COVID surge of publications, our projections were blown out of the water for the number of articles coming out of Iowa State over the last 18 months. So with the Wiley agreement, that meant this huge spike in volume of articles. And if you look at publishers like MDPI and Frontiers, and you just look at the race in article volume, that's the other piece that I feel like is really, really troubling. And to think through what sustainability looks like for that type of model where we have incentivized publishers to put out ever more articles, I think it's really troubling. And so when I think about business models anymore, I am very much interested in the ones that are putting equity first, the ones that are going to control for not just price, but also volume. So those are a few thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Curtis. I'm going to turn over to Emily now, because I know that some of the work you're doing at MIT Press is particularly focused around these kind of questions of equity. How do you see the press positioning itself effectively in this kind of a future where, we're starting to see, large amounts of corporate control, effectively the oligopolistic conditions that we saw in the subscription market being transitioned to OA. Where does MIT Press fit into this kind of a future?
Very good question. There are already so many good threads going on that it's hard to know which one to pick up first. But I think that the push towards more collective models will increase. What we're doing with our new open books model, which is a collective action model, I think we'll see more of that. I think that will be amplified. And maybe, Charlotte, if I could agree and also disagree, I think that we do have communities of users, but we don't see a lot of acting collectively. And that's something that we're experiencing in talking to different stakeholders, talking to a lot of libraries about participating in direct to open. The model that we're working on is that there are a lot of structures in place that ensure that people are acting individually as individual institutions. And I think that looking at things like some of the moves that have happened recently, Big Ten Academic Alliance, for example, talking about acting more collectively and using funds collectively, I think those, or at least I would like to think that more of those sorts of collective actions will happen. If for no other reason than budget pressures will make sure that money will have to be pooled. I think that there are, I think alongside that, we'll also see an increase in preprints as a non-subscription direction within certain research communities. That's already happening, and I think will continue apace.
So yeah. Emily, if I can hop in here. So I'm really interested, of course, given my background in Scope 3, but also behind Subscribe to Open. So and it's really nice to see that there are a diversity of new models emerging. Direct to open, we're seeing the CAB model from PLOS. How do you think these collective approaches scale? Because right now they're being implemented, but in kind of like smaller niche ways. How do you see these collective approaches scaling? And I turn that back to you and back to Charla.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the big hurdles. Thinking about what the sort of major hurdles are, administration and data are two huge ones, especially for smaller presses where you're working with a pretty lean capacity to implement new models. And on the library side, juggling a diversity of models becomes challenging. One of the things that I think will be important is more sort of transparency about how these models work, such that similar models can be implemented across different types of presses. So to some degree, you still are able to contain or have diversity within the types of models, but sort of a similar or shared structure in that sort of collective action. I think would be one way I would see it scaling. But I don't know that we could talk about it sort of in scaling in a sort of a traditional market sense, perhaps.
Sure. Charla, same question to you.
Yeah. So it's going to require all of the, right now, not very many business models are being actually presented to the library community. Publishers out there are probably going, what? We're sending them out all the time, right? But they're not always hitting home because of how funding structures work at the local level for those institutions. Everybody's used to doing subscription. This is the way we've always done, or purchase models, right? This is just how it's always been done. And so and you want to, they get into habits, and until a model that they can actually engage in is presented to them, at a time whenever they need it, then they will engage. But until then, they see open access as something that CDL does, or that Iowa State does, or at least here in the United States, or all of Europe, which is also a myth. And so understanding, there's an education piece, just like with a lot of publishers out there. A lot of publishers feel like that the only way to go is APC. Well, if you have a lot of funding coming in from funding agencies that support the research already, APC is a good thing because you're keeping the money in the system. The problem is that whenever you're only approaching research-focused institutions to fund that, then all of those who had been subscribing for teaching and learning purposes, or for lower research levels, all of a sudden are excluded. That money is gone. And this addresses one of the questions that was put in the Q&A. We need to have more mixed models. We can't have just an APC model and just a non-APC model. In order to keep, as Ralph Schimmer says, keeping the money in the system means we need to be more flexible and creative with the kinds of models to be able to access all of the funding that is out there for those who want to spend it. And then it can scale, because then you will grow the community around it, or maintain the community at least around whatever legacy publisher has already, what community they've already grown. It can stay maintained at that level, because just like tiered pricing models can help bring a wider diversity of participation, we need to do the same thing with OA models.
Thanks, Charlotte. I want to kind of take this question over to Curtis, to know that you're, in the Subscribe to Open community of practice, you're looking at these issues of kind of adoption by other publishers and kind of scaling these kinds of models. Can you tell us what you're learning in that space, and kind of speaking to what Charlotte was just talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think specific to Subscribe to Open, which I have to point out, like in our scenario, I think one of the challenges, like to have a conversation about the future of business models when our scenario has posited that publisher societies arrange journal publishing deals directly with funders. That seems to just undercut like a whole bunch of the work that we're all doing right now. But to Subscribe to Open in the community of practice, Cameron, I'm trying to think back, like when I met you, it was at the Berkeley meeting like 3 years ago. I think before annual reviews was rolling out Subscribe to Open. So if you walk forward from that 3 years and look at the level of interest, the level of adoptions of Subscribe to Open, it's pretty remarkable, the pace. And so is there a really large publisher that's adopted Subscribe to Open at this point? No. Are there large publishers taking part in this community of practice, trying to think through perhaps across some portion of the portfolio, would a mixed model actually work? I just had a conversation with one of the bigger publishers just last week about this very topic. So I think there's a remarkable amount of interest. And back to this idea of this 30-year horizon, wherever we're going to end up, I actually think we're planting the seeds for stronger collaborations, more direct library publisher partnerships. And I think that's going to sustain. I think what we will see in 30 years is that those relationships have actually blossomed. And it's, I don't know exactly what they will look like, but I don't think they're fully reflected in our scenario. But I know we probably shouldn't just spend the session attacking our scenario. It was
for sure.
It has triggered a lot of thinking. It has triggered a lot of thinking, for me to go through this. So I appreciate how it was framed.
That's nice, and appreciating the multiple threads that are coming out of this conversation. I actually wanted to turn this over to Jamie, because I want to ask you a couple of questions, Jamie. First is kind of around this idea of partnerships and in collective action, to get your perspective on how you see those kinds of approaches shaping the future of scholarly communications. But then also wanted to ask you about what you see the role of the aggregators of this world in the scholarly communication industry, particularly in a future where, as the scenario assumes, the majority of content is open.
That's an interesting one. Actually, there's a couple of different points there, of course. And sort of going back to what Curtis started us with, the event horizon we're using here is probably longer than all of our careers so far in this industry. So we've seen so much change in just the 20 years that I've worked in publishing that I think taking us forward into these 30 years, we're going to see probably more diversity in business models going forward. There was a couple of points I wanted to pick up on as well around scale. And I think given the problems that we're collectively working on in terms of what are we trying to solve with research, we may see, I think, scale being appropriate to the problem being worked on and the community that's working on that problem. And perhaps they don't have to all be at a global scale. So I think that's one thing to consider. On the other side, the aggregator view, I mean, typically aggregators work on a very different basis and are serving a very different purpose in the ecosystem. Well, I have only obviously worked with ProQuest in that sense that what they're looking to do there really is more on the discovery side of the business than they are on the content creation. And discovery is like a very complicated sort of action. Doesn't mean the same thing to an undergraduate student as it means to a very experienced researcher. So there's a lot of different business or use cases that are being considered across our whole ecosystems. Where aggregators work really is to try and add value to, or maybe consistency to the output that is coming from multiple publishers. And you have to sort of delve into the really to understand what we mean by publishers there as well. So in the group that I was working with, we started by working with between 9,000 and 10,000 different publishers of different scales, right down to an individual who was publishing a journal on behalf of his institution. When we started to move into considering how we worked with open access publishers, we suddenly increased that scale from 9,000 or 10,000 to more like 20,000 publishers of different scales, all giving different outputs in different formats, in different consistency of that approach, and obviously with very different metadata standards as well around those. So I think where aggregators of different types are really adding value or expect to continue to add value is on bringing some consistency across that really broad range of content types. And then we're very focused here on research outputs, but if you look at some of the communities I was working with in ProQuest, such as historians, the content they're interested in is primary sources, and that's a completely different market and a completely different approach in terms of how we bring that content into a discovery focus.
Great, thanks, Jamie. I'm going to pick up on a question from Jocelyn Dawson, which is in the Q&A, and it's particularly relating to the point around societies and university presses and nonprofit publishers entering into alliances. And the question is, she says, Duke University Press has lost out on many, oh, I just lost that question. Where'd you go?
It went into the answered.
Sorry,
Okay.
Cameron, that was my fault. I can read it for you. So Duke University Press has lost out on many publishing service RFPs from society journals because of larger commercial publishers offering better financial models. How do we incentivize societies to move toward a collective action publishing model or to publishing with a non-profit if we can't guarantee their revenue?
So I'm going to turn that question over to Charla first, and to get your ideas around, particularly as consortia tend to be a principal revenue source for publishers, how what kind of arrangements can be entered into that can help incentivize societies to be more progressive around collective approaches?
Well, translating from what a journal is doing within a bundled subscription package over to acting independently, or even being bundled in a smaller package at a nonprofit mission-driven publishing instance like a university press, requires a lot of education. I'm going to say that a lot. There's so much that we assume we understand about this space: the librarians, the publishers, the scholars, the societies, everybody. I've seen this for several instances where a journal will leave a commercial publisher and go to like a library publisher or a university press. There are those who leave because they want to do their own thing. They reduce the revenue that they are required to be able to function to very minimal amounts, because they just want to publish. They want it to be open. They want to have more diversity of their editorial boards. They just want to have a lot more empowerment of what that journal is and work with often a local library publisher or a university press at one of the editorial boards, home institutions. The societies are another issue because they've been using that subscription to pay for more than just the publishing. And this has been, again, hidden. It's been invisible. One of the many activities that's been invisible. And so, and who's to say if that journal within that bundled package actually was getting the amount of revenue they've been receiving directly from the funders? There's a lot of cross subsidization. All of our organizations do this. There are some line items that just don't make the money that they need to. We see this in the university press world with monographs, and they subsidize with other things. And the same thing happens, I think, within the bundled subscription packages. So it doesn't, from moving from one place to another, expecting the same amounts of revenue and being able to do the same thing, that needs to be communicated really well, that that's not always going to be possible, especially if you have one journal. Because libraries, when they look at evaluating costs and how much they're investing in one journal in a subscription package, they are taking the total amount they pay with the amount of journals that are there and divide. And that's the most that they're willing to be able to give, to actually support it in a different kind of model in most cases, because they prefer cost neutrality. They don't have a lot of wiggle room in their budgets as they shrink. And right now, everybody's wanting that cost neutrality. So the funding is lost as whenever it goes from one to the other. How do we square that circle or circle the square? How do we do that? Well, it requires a lot of education. It requires a new level of support for the society, for them to understand maybe there are other ways for them to get revenue as opposed from just their journal. And that's can be a deal breaker. And until something like that is resolved so that they can go to any publisher they want and still be able to support the services they provide to the community they serve, they're going to probably stay with those commercial entities. They're providing wonderful services to those societies. And why would they leave that? It comes down to just human nature and the incentives and what they're trying to do. So I don't know, Jocelyn, I really wish I did, but it comes into the culture of that society, what they're really trying to achieve and who's going to help them do that. And until we can band together and build some kind of infrastructure to support societies and what they do that's separate from publishing, they're going to stay at those commercial entities and get what they need there.
Or either just to jump in and say, connecting to a later point on this scenario, the potential for alliances and mergers with societies, university presses, and nonprofit publishers. I mean, that I think is one potential future where what Jocelyn's asking about has the possibility of finding its way, in that one way forward is scale through that sort of alliance on the nonprofit side. I do think that there are a lot of infrastructural hurdles that we all face, especially on the smaller press side. But I think that the amplification through those sorts of mergers or alliances might be the better word, is one way that sort of leveraging value together might provide an answer.
Thanks, Emily. You completely anticipated my next question, which was going to be directly to you on that issue. But I'm gonna take a question from Sarah Ruhi, which is in the Q&A. Sarah Ruhi from PLOS, who's been one of the major forces behind their collective action initiatives, and particularly the CAP program. And so she's curious on our thought on kind of this idea of new model saturation. And she's receiving feedback from her partners that there's just too many models. And as such, it's a little hard to navigate as more new models enter this space. So I guess one of the questions I want to ask each of the panelists is, what can we do to make things a little more straightforward for libraries to understand? How can they understand the values that kind of underlie and underpin these models, and encourage investment in collective approaches if they're getting overwhelmed by this influx of new models? So I'm going to take it first to Curtis.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think first I would say we need to be patient And I think we probably have more models that need to come out. I don't think we've totally solved the puzzle here. I find more complexity when I think across, all the different publishers we have agreements with. That's a level of complexity. I mean, there's not 9,000 of them, but there's hundreds of them that we're paying bills for. Any particular publisher with their open model, or in the case of PLOS, it's great that Sarah asked this because we're just working through our PLOS renewal, and we had to get on the phone just to work through how the different pieces of the different models, what all of that means for our bill. So I think any particular publisher, when we think about going to a mixed model approach where maybe you're doing some of the portfolio is read and publish, some of it is subscribed open, you start adding on a third or fourth model, I think, yeah, it gets kind of complicated. But I think librarians are pretty savvy folks. I think we're normalizing these models. I think when you consider how long they've actually been around, which in the case of some of these, like, I don't know, Emily, direct to open, is it a year old or a year and a half old? Give it a couple of years. People will adjust and they will learn, where they fit across, the acquisitions and the investments that we're making. So I'm not worried about model saturation. I think that we need to actually have more of an appetite for developing interesting models, and we need to be ready to adapt the models that we have as we learn.
Emily, so to what extent are you? Sorry, to what extent are you facing this problem?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's always heartening to hear Curtis speak from the library perspective, and to sort of say, all right, yes, we have an appetite for more of it. And I think that I have to think that the core of that is that we could probably all agree, if we can't agree on anything other than this, is that there are a lot of things that need to be fixed that aren't working. And the thing about these new models coming out is, look, there's a lot of us just trying to experiment and find new ways forward in the acknowledgement that we can't continue with these inequitable models. We can't continue with a closed system. The calls from researchers and from institutions, all point towards more openness in content and more access, along the lines of equity. So, I would hope we can have a bit more patience, as Curtis says, especially because we can probably also acknowledge that the academic system is not a fast-moving one. So, often things do take a while. We've felt all along with Direct to Open that if we don't get there in the first year, that doesn't necessarily mean that this model isn't robust. It just may take an extra cycle to get this over the line, though we're happy with the progress so far. So I think that, I think we can manage a bit of complexity if the hope is that ultimately there will be more streamlining. I think that's sort of inevitable, and that we will, if we hold sort of the mission and the values at the core of it, that we will get to something that sits better with everybody. Maybe that's a little idealistic.
That's great. I'm all for idealism. So we're rapidly running out of time and so much interesting stuff to talk about. I don't want to neglect the last point on in this scenario, which I think is a really important aspect that we've only very lightly touched on in this session. And I think it's fair to say that we're seeing trends towards commercial consolidation around publishing services and research data services. And this bullet speaks to that. What are the concerns that we should be thinking about when we're looking at a future where large publishers have pivoted to these kinds of services? And I'm going to turn that question over first to Jamie to address. Like concerns or opportunities, however you want to frame it.
Well, I think the change or the shift that you're seeing there is like a whole scale shift for an organization. So think from a publisher's perspective, if you're moving into these new services, you're actually reorganizing your entire entity really around a whole set of skills that perhaps don't even exist. So there's a major investment requirement there, both in terms of redesigning your organization, the recruitment of the teams that would actually develop those services. There's investment in infrastructure and completely new technologies. And I think quite typically those those kinds of technologies don't sit traditionally in publishing houses. And so that's how do you actually finance those kinds of investments that are required longer term? That's not going to come through our existing business models being reinvested from the sort of library community into through our subscriptions or our transformative agreements into new technology. So it has to come from another source. Perhaps as a startup in this area, you have access to things like venture capitalism and various other sources of finance to move into these sectors. But if you're a large scale organization, then really that's closed off to you. And so we're going to see more of these kind of mergers and acquisitions coming, and probably from the big tech industries that have those technologies available to them.
Sure, and yeah, like the scenario is positing, we've got big tech companies becoming increasingly active. What do you think? Charla, I'm going to turn this question over to you. What are your concerns around that as a possible outcome?
Well, privacy is a big issue around all of this. How is that being handled? Representing the library community and thinking about the faculty, researchers, students involved that would be, part of this. Thinking as someone who is trying to help shift, to open, and I'm also concerned about the funding being sucked up into, the library funding itself, the institutional funding. So instead of paying for, where 70% of a budget is going towards big commercial publishers for journals, then, 70% of it is going to this infrastructure to support this instead. And that is another concern of mine. One thing, though, that the scenario isn't really revealing is what is the nonprofit sector doing in all of this as providing an alternative. Because it's omitted doesn't mean that it wouldn't exist. And I'm thinking about the efforts of like the Invest in Open Infrastructure, but a lot of consortia right now that are building their own infrastructure on open source software. And yes, it takes a lot of work. It's not free, but the idea of the library community forming together, just like we are around, trying to fund open scholarship. What if 30 years from now that's been figured out? Now what role will consortia play? What role will the library community play? And I think a lot of it will actually be in infrastructure itself, but also the community building around it, the connection, the capacity building that's needed to support the scholarly communities, as well as the teaching and learning activities that are, the institutions are charged to do. And so there's also this other piece, which they'll probably talk about in the next session, is open science in general. How are we communicating this scholarship around the big global issues that are out there, like pandemics and climate change? And I think that the library communities can, and a lot of the mission-driven publishers, and I would think the commercial as well, would be focusing on that, and where are those efforts and how are all these technologies actually helping to make the world a better place? And I would love to be competing in that, because then that means that we're trying to solve the world's problems and competing to do that in that way. But yeah, that's why the concerns of privacy, integrity of the data, of the systems that store the data, all of that are still major concerns.
So I guess I'm going to turn the question over to Curtis to respond to what Charlotte just said. I'm particularly interested in hearing your perspective as a librarian around the appetite or interest in investing in alternative infrastructures that are kind of provided by the community as opposed to by large commercial entities.
Well, I think there's huge appetite for that, and the challenge today, we're supposed to be talking about this 30-year scenario, but the challenge today, and I tell Kale and Thaney this, at the Invest in Open Infrastructure group, right now there's not a lot of investments out there for libraries to make, but I think there's a tremendous amount of interest in funding that. As we think about shifting where our money is flowing, that's one of the channels that it needs to flow to. We just need to connect library investors with the open infrastructure that needs to be funded. And I think that open infrastructure, some of it is going to persist, and it's going to be out here at this 30-year horizon. And I'm not sure which ones that will be. But I'd also like to just say, I feel like the tension and the animosity between, libraries and big publishers, that's all about lock-in and content that is, a monopoly on this content that we have to buy. And if we are moving into this open world where the publications are open, the data is open, the methods are open, and a publisher is transitioned to the point where they can offer some type of a service that takes this open content and makes it useful to an institution, I don't have a problem with that. I think that, there's a strain of anti-big publisher that I think really ties in more with when the content is owned and behind the paywall. If we're in a competitive landscape where publishers are trying to develop services on top of open content, they're competing with, as the scenario says, with big tech companies also trying to build out things over this open content. That's a competitive environment that's very different than the one that we've been engaging with publishers, big publishers in the past. And I hope that comes to fruition. I want to see this competition, and one of the competitors will be our open infrastructure providers. So I think that'd be a nice world.
That's I completely agree, Curtis, and thanks so much. It's one of the things I've thought about a lot. In a world where the majority of content is open, then what are libraries paying for? What are publishers competing over? And I think if we, to the extent that we can facilitate a real competitive market in publishing services, and also have a space for the nonprofit initiatives in that space, all the better. I want to. We've only got a few minutes left, and I really want to. There's so much that we can talk about. I really want to close this session with a thread that I think has been kind of underlying all of this, and that Curtis touched on early in the session. I want to go turn by turn to each of the panelists, and I'll start with Jamie. But my question really is around building an equitable and inclusive future in scholarly publishing, and how business models can reflect that. So particularly thinking of the audience that we have today, learned and professional society publishers, what moves can they make? And what should they be thinking about when it comes to equity and inclusiveness moving forward, particularly as it comes to business models? So, Jamie.
That's a pretty tough question to end on. So I think
that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in terms of the professional societies, I think this really speaks to their overall mission in the first place. I think some of those societies are asking deep questions of themselves right now as to the purpose that they have, how they represent their communities, and also how they make those or expand those communities to be more inclusive. Certainly working with a number of society publishers in the past sort of 20 years or so, that's been a very big change for most of those societies. And part of the reason that they're focused on how they gain revenue, so how do they actually finance their missions? I don't think we have a determined answer at this point. One thing, like going back to an earlier discussion, I think one of the things that's missing really is across the professional societies is seeing more alliances across disciplines. I haven't seen a lot of societies coming together within their own discipline necessarily on these kind of issues, let alone across the sort of traditional boundaries between disciplines. And as we let's use our 30-year event horizon. If we're trying to solve global problems, then we need obviously societies to really take a role in gaining inclusive viewpoints, working across the traditional boundaries of those societies, and bringing people together. I think really where at the moment it's very focused on a discipline rather than a problem that they're trying to solve.
Jamie, I'm going to pass the mic to Charlotte to just give me 10 to 15 seconds on this topic. even tougher as we're running out of time.
Experiment with mixed models. Find ways to get the APC funding plus any crowdfunding kind of models to allow for free, not just free to read, but free to publish. Make sure they're inclusive of the READ institutions. Do not exclude them. They want to participate in open. They want to bring value to their local level and with the dollars they steward. And then smaller publishers. Libraries want to work with you. We need to maintain diversity of publishers so that we maintain diversity of the scholarship and the authors that produce it. And so participate, find ways, look to colleagues across your sector. Contact me, Curtis, Emily. We all are wanting to help make sure that the smaller publishers stay alive. That helps with a lot of the equity of scholarship overall.
Emily, real quick.
I'll
I'll ask you to say a couple words real quick.
I mean, so much of what's been said, but also just you know, in terms of moving towards more equity, there's still so much listening to be done, and you know, we're working on more solutions, I think, but access to read and to publish is important, and just a small piece to add to that hasn't been said. One thing I always wonder is how we do that in a more multilingual way, because that is certainly still a piece that's unsolved. But yeah, just there's a lot more listening to be done.
Thank you. And to find a final word to Curtis.
Well, on the equity question, I'll just throw a plug in for a Charleston session that Sarah Rui and I are doing. I think we are going to be dealing with APCs for some period of time going forward, and I feel like we really need to figure out how to do waivers in the best possible way. I mean, that's just a very small kernel of this. We're also making agreements where there's no APC involved. That's a great strategy, but short-term progress and transparency around waivers, I would love to see progress on that.
Okay, with that, I'm going to give a sincere round of thanks to all of you for being part of this session, to the amazing panelists, to Jamie as a co-chair. Thank you all, and look forward to viewing the next session. Thanks.
Thanks, Cameron.
Thanks, Cameron.